Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Please just pop in the Q&A panel if you are struggling to hear me, because we've had a few little technical issues this morning, but hopefully you're all there and you can hear me. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to MorePay's webinar on discrimination at work, tackling complex cases. I'm Molly Ackland, Content and Communications Manager here at MorePay. We've got lots to cover this morning, so let's get straight into a bit of housekeeping and the agenda. So in terms of the agenda for this morning, Michelle is going to start off by examining current trends and the future of workplace diversity. She'll then cover positive discrimination and why it's problematic with real case law examples. We'll then explore how to prevent discrimination, as well as handling discrimination cases. Michelle will then walk you through how to build a strong ED&I strategy. And finally, we'll move into the Q&A section, where you'll have an opportunity to ask Michelle any questions that you may have. So as I say, after the main presentation, we'll move into the Q&A section of the webinar. You may have noticed that your microphone is on mute, but we do want to hear from you. So please drop your questions into the question panel shown here. We've had a phenomenal response to this webinar, so I imagine we're going to have lots of questions, but Michelle will do her very best to get through as many as she can at the end of this session. Don't worry if you're facing any technical difficulties. We will send everyone a recording later today and a copy of the slides too. And also just take a moment to familiarise yourself with the audio settings as displayed here. So before I hand over to Michelle, I'm conscious that we'll have some people on the webinar that aren't familiar with MorePay, so I'll just give a very brief introduction. We provide payroll and HR software, as well as outsourcing services to UK businesses. We've been around since 1966 and have all of the accreditations that you'd expect. Our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and here's how we do it. So we've built payroll and HR software that's easy to use. We deliver quality outsourcing options, and all of this means worry-free compliance for businesses. On the slide here, you'll see some of the businesses that trust us to take care of their payroll and HR. And did I mention we're award-winning? On this slide, you'll see some of the industry awards and shortlists that we've picked up over the last couple of years. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can simply drop me a message using the Q&A panel. So that's enough about us. Let's meet today's presenter. So I'm just going to start by introducing you to Michelle, who you may recognise if you've attended some of our webinars in the past. Michelle is our HR Services Director and has been with MorePay since 2017. She is CIPD qualified with 20 years of both operational and strategic HR experience. Michelle is responsible for running all of the HR services activities within MorePay. So good morning, Michelle. I'm now going to hand over to yourself to get started on today's webinar.
Fabulous. Thank you, Molly. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. As always, this is a huge topic with lots to cover. So we were going to try and give you the best we can in terms of an overview about diversity, equity and inclusion, and then if you've got any questions, we will do our best to answer them at the end. But diversity, equity and inclusion efforts have been evolving for decades in the UK, and this is because of both legal frameworks, but also society shifts, changes, evolves, and people's expectations of what is needed and is necessary evolves as well, and that really impacts organisations and how they function as a business. At the heart of this concept, though, it's about promoting frameworks within organisations that ensures there's fair treatment for all. But you may have seen in the headlines in some business publications and certainly out on social media, the question being asked is DE&I dying, which sounds quite dramatic, but it's certainly an important topic to take a look back. And we're going to tackle that within the why topic of discrimination, as I've already mentioned. But I do first want to address this question. So in terms of, is it being scaled back or is it just evolving? One of the headlines that we've got is that 1 in 8 companies are actually scaling back their efforts in DE&I, and that is potentially leading people to believe that it is on its way to the grave, it's on its way out, it's losing favour. But I think it's really important to get underneath that and understand what that actually means, because the truth is there is always going to be a legal framework that businesses need to abide by. And as I already mentioned, there are certainly societal expectations that are shifting. So my real feeling on this is that it is evolving. Now, a recent study by Forbes showed that 8% of companies are either maintaining or increasing their budgets associated with DE&I. And 65% of companies surveyed said they will still keep their DE&I budgets the same. And 22% actually plan to increase their budget. So I think there is still a real want and a need out there for businesses to actually keep doing something about it, keep pushing forward and keep making the changes that are necessary. But there is an aspect that it may feel like it's faded, but really it isn't. And some of the things that I just want to call out, I think some public initiatives are being shelved, and I think this is just indicative of the economy and the situation that we're all in at the moment as a country. And there have been some public layoffs of DE&I professionals, and some businesses are making the choice where they've brought in somebody to specifically focus on it, to lay off those people and potentially make it part of somebody else's job. And this is a lot of budget scrutiny post the economic downturn that we're experiencing. But the shift really is that there is still strategy over symbolism, and that these things are still really important to businesses. So even where businesses have had to make a decision to cut budgets in a certain way, they are still trying to maintain the same levels that they did before in terms of tackling the issues. And it is all about being integrated, data-driven and accountable. So I just really ask you to question yourselves when you see these articles. There's so much interesting stuff out there on various websites, on social media, on LinkedIn, and they've all got really valid points, but that's quite that headline that you may see flick up every now and then. I just encourage you to really get into the detail of some of the articles that you see and kind of educate yourself and your businesses. And that's what we're trying to do in this webinar, is keep this topic alive. So on to the next slide then, why it still matters. And I think it is really, if we all were honest, it is undeniable that it still matters. One thing already is about societal expectations, and I think employees' expectations, it says they remain high, but I think potentially they are higher than they've ever been about what is important. So if you think of Gen Z and millennials, they demand inclusive, value-led workplaces kind of as a minimum. They have really different expectations to generations before, and things that we would have seen in the past that might have been nice to haves are just seen as baseline for the sort of newer generations. And that's really important to remember, that the expectations are changing. They're certainly demanding authenticity. It isn't just a tick box exercise. This is what I've done to make sure that it looks like it's on the agenda. What actually is the truth behind it, and they're pushing companies to align what they're saying with actual actions and follow up. And it's just becoming a baseline, not a bonus. But we've still got to think about what the business case is for inclusion and why it's still important for businesses to get this right. And research has certainly shown that diverse companies can outperform competitors. When you have a rich, diverse workforce, that naturally brings an advantage. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to experience above average profitability. Just bear with me 1 second, we're having, I think, some technical problems. Let me try again. Can anybody hear me now? Just 1 second. Okay, apologies, but I'm hoping that this might work now. Yeah, we are seeing thumbs up, which is really good. Yeah, massive apologies for that. We will get that sorted. But hopefully we're on the right track now. We have had some technical difficulties this morning, as is always the case. Okay, so back to why D&E matters, and talking about the business case for inclusion. So I've said here that research shows that diverse companies outperform competitors, and it's still a really important part of the makeup of an organisation to have a diverse workforce. It gives you so many advantages in terms of the experience and the skills that you bring to the workplace. And here it's saying that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to experience above average profitability. And those with ethnic diversity at top levels are 35% more likely to outperform competitors. And those figures themselves are pretty stark and amazing, and definitely a reason to keep DE&I on the agenda. And Josh Burskin, who is a very famous analyst who you will have seen probably plastered all over business publications and social media, has said that companies that embrace diversity and inclusion in all aspects of their businesses statistically outperform their peers. And that is why it's really important to keep it on the agenda, and why we say that it still matters. So moving into a bit more of the practicalities now, I want to touch on positive discrimination. So if we just flick to the next slide. So what is positive discrimination? It is probably something you've heard of. And if you wind back maybe 15, 20 years, it became a bit of a buzzword and something that was potentially seen as a positive thing and something that was going to be good for the diversity efforts. This is essentially giving preferential treatment to individuals in a workplace based on their protected characteristic. And you'll see down the left-hand side that just for reference, we've outlined what the protected characteristics within law are. But it is important to know that in general, positive discrimination is unlawful under the Equality Act of 2010. Businesses, though, can use what's known as positive action, which allows individuals with one of those protected characteristics to have a bit more of a level playing field. So this is in anything to do with recruitment, training, development, internal promotion. There are actions that you can take to help level the playing field. But the difficulty that some people have in understanding this, or the difficulty that comes with it initiating this, it's got to be proportionate action to reduce the disadvantage, but not actual positive discrimination. And I do believe that in terms of positive discrimination, if you speak to anybody, they would certainly like to believe that they were given either jobs, promotions, training, development on their own skills and own merit, rather than being given it just to tick a box. Has the slides come off? Oh, my slides disappeared. Sorry, we are having technical difficulties. They've come back now. Thank you. Sorry about this, guys. It is one of those days, I'm afraid you're going to have to bear with us, but I think everything's okay now. So yeah, in terms of positive discrimination, it is something that is unlawful now, but you've got to think about what positive actions that you can take. And hopefully it is something that you've been familiar with before. But to put this into action, if we just look onto the next slide, we've actually got a case study that talks about positive discrimination and is a bit of a cautionary tale for us all. So this is Mr. Furlong versus Cheshire Police from 2018. Now, the basis of this is that Cheshire Police felt they were taking positive action and that this wasn't positive discrimination. They were taking actions to level the playing field. But the background is that Mr. Furlong was a white, heterosexual, non-disabled male, and he applied for a police constable role. He performed well in all the assessments, but he was rejected at the final stage. And he suspected discrimination in favour of a candidate with protected characteristics. So he brought a claim of direct discrimination based on sex, race, and sexual orientation. Cheshire Police's defence was arguing that they had applied positive action, not discrimination. Their aim was to improve workforce diversity, and they felt they were doing this by levelling the playing field, and they claimed that all 127 candidates for the role of police constable were of equal merit, and they used the Equality Act of 2010 to justify this. On to the next slide then, I'll just talk to you about what the findings actually were. The tribunal found that the actions actually amounted to positive discrimination and not lawful positive action. There was no clear evidence of the disadvantage or need to justify this approach, so their evidence was really lacking in this point, and this is really important. If you are taking positive action, there needs to be the evidence behind it. The tribunal found that the police had actually just applied a blanket policy and weren't taking individuals into account, and therefore it was not proportionate. And I look at this now with hindsight, obviously the benefit of hindsight, that the tribunal did not accept that 127 candidates were or could have been of equal merit. There had to be some differences, even that came outside of protected characteristics. And the tribunal just found that in general they had failed to consider the broader impact of what their measures were doing, and therefore actually disadvantaged somebody who was not in one of those protected characteristics. So the outcome was that Mr. Furlong's claim was successful, and the tribunal found that indeed direct discrimination had occurred. So the key takeaway from this is to really think about the positive action that you are taking or want to take to help encourage diversity and make sure that there's a level playing field. But there are strict legal tests to put in place before you do this. So it's one of those areas that I would always advise you to seek more advice on this, whether that's through your own internal HR team or through more pay if you're one of our customers, about the what you're trying to put into place to do this. It's got to be targeted, it's got to be proportionate, and it has to be based on clear evidence and a real thought given to the differences that are within the candidate pool. And a broad brush approach can easily cross the line and become unlawful. So just a little bit of a cautionary tale about positive discrimination. But moving on then to the important part of this, which is really thinking about how you ensure that DE&I remains on your org's agenda, but that it's evolving with time. You've got to remember that it's not something that is static. It's not a tick box exercise. It's done. We've written it down. We all move on to the next 5 to 10 years. It is something that needs to continue to change. And the biggest part of that is just asking that question of how you can proactively prevent discrimination in your organisation. Now, in most of the webinars that you've probably heard me do on various topics in the HR world, the biggest thing that you can do in all circumstances when you're trying to put in an initiative, but it's particularly important when you're talking about discrimination, is to train and educate your organisation, all your people within your organisation. You've got to talk about diversity, what it means, what the legalities are, what it means to different people's experiences of it. Get employees involved in discussing their own experience. That is really one of the most powerful and effective ways to get this as part of your culture and to have this embedded in your organisation. And it's about educating people. So policies alone are really not enough. We're going to talk about how to document the policies, how to document the strategies, and that is really important. But actually getting your people involved, understanding, knowing, and then living and breathing this as part of your organisation's culture is the biggest thing that you can do. So if you're looking at training people, it helps make prevention a daily priority for people. You talk about things like respect, inclusion, accountability, have it talked about in team meetings. Make sure that your policies and training are regularly updated, as I've always said, because things are evolving, and checking in with employees on whether they feel the culture is inclusive in reality. And a really good way to do that is within employment engagement surveys. So when you're setting up your employment engagement surveys, it's a really good idea to have questions in there that directly link into how they feel about equity and diversity and inclusion, particularly in that area, because it is anonymised in most instances when you're doing the employee engagement survey. It gives people an opportunity to really talk about how they feel, and then you can adjust your training and education policy beyond that. Just make sure it's training that works, tailor it to what you're role specific, and make sure that everyone is involved, right from new starters through to the long-standing leadership that you've got in there. And then in terms of what you cover in that training, I mean, there is an absolute huge list of things you can cover, and you will decide what is right for your organisation. But there's covering some of the legalities and making sure they understand the basics of different forms of discrimination, particularly talking about unconscious bias and microaggressions that might happen in the workplace, things that people might not even consider to be discrimination. You know, an example could be, and unfortunately I've still heard it in various places and seen articles on it, of an interview happening with a woman in her 20s or 30s and being asked about whether she's planning on having a family before she's even joined the organisation. I mean, you know, that could link to direct discrimination, but it stems from a potentially uneducated and unconscious bias, and these are the things that we still need to change. Also think about covering up in your training how people can speak up safely and constructively, knowing how and when to escalate, and making sure that your managers and your leadership feel comfortable in tackling these issues. The next area then is talking about your actual policies, and you need to look through all your policies and make sure that DE&I runs through the very heart of all those policies. So start with having, you can actually have an equity, diversity and inclusion policy, which really lays out what you intend to do and what the routes to follow for people are in this. But look at bullying, discrimination and harassment, look at those policies, look at all the other policies that you've got, the disciplinary and grievance policies, your maternity policies, your adoption policies. All those policies need to be reviewed and make sure that they align with the fundamental values that you're putting in place to tackle DE&I, and make sure that you regularly review those policies as well, because things change so often. A big thing to talk about is about the reporting routes for if there are potential issues. Often we say in these things, you know, prevention's better than the cure, but these things may and can happen. And we do see a lot of this within More Pay from our customers where issues have been raised. And one of the key things you need to make sure is that people feel there's a safe reporting route, because you can't deal with any potential discrimination issues if you don't know they're happening. And you won't know what's happening if people don't feel it's safe to come forward. Sure that you've got a good process that shows there is more than one person or route to report to. So you might have HR, senior leader, you might have a dedicated diversity leader. You can create a confidential email or phone line that's monitored by trained staff, or you can offer anonymous feedback options for people to report things. The only cautionary tale that I'd add to the anonymous feedback is that sometimes it can be quite difficult to really get to the heart of the problem if it's anonymized and you can't talk to that person, but at least it is a route to open up the issue to the organisation. Make sure that your reporting policy is really clear, so it outlines how your concerns are recorded and reviewed, what will happen next, who will be involved, how long steps and stages may take, and how the employee will be supported during that process. And then the last point on here is really making sure that all reporting contacts, so anybody who may be receiving one of these concerns, is thoroughly trained and knows what to do, how to move it forward, how to manage expectations, and how to support everyone involved. It's really important for setting the tone. But if you've got all those things in place, you may still find yourself in a situation where a discrimination issue arises and you are faced with having to deal with this. So on to now how to handle these issues properly. When someone raises a concern, whether that's formally or informally, how you respond really says everything about your culture and really sets the tone for how things will move going forward. And the biggest piece of advice we give here is to start by listening. So that first conversation is going to set the tone for the rest of the process. Listen and let them speak without interruption. Don't necessarily jump straight into giving them solutions or giving them reasons or excuses as to why those things happened. Just listen and let them lay out what their concerns are. You maybe need to ask some open-ended questions to get some more information, but just do remember that you don't need to have all the answers at this point. It really just is about understanding what the problem is and establishing what the next steps are. But the next practical steps of handling complaints then is to follow the grievance procedure. And every organisation should have a really clear procedure in place for a grievance procedure. Employees should know where to find it, and managers and those involved should know exactly how this flows. But a strong grievance procedure will have somebody, will include an investigation by someone impartial who will take all the information and review it. It will be handled fairly and without delay, and it will be resolved with a clear outcome and the option to appeal. And a really important part is to make sure that everything is documented from start to finish. I think it's really important to know that complaints are issues, especially around potential discrimination, are very stressful for everybody involved. And it's being sure to check in with both parties, so not just the person raising the complaint. I have seen situations over the years where there have been complaints raised and we have supported customers in dealing with them, and it's actually turned out that it was a malicious complaint and something that wasn't actually true. Now, you can only get to that when you do a thorough and full investigation with somebody impartial. And this isn't about placing blame on one side or the other at the beginning. It's making sure that everybody understands and is supported all the way through. It is a very difficult situation to handle. At the end of a grievance, there is obviously always the right to appeal. So if the employee disagrees with the outcome, then they should be given the opportunity to appeal and the full appeal process followed. It must be heard by someone different than the original decision maker. Ideally, it could be somebody more senior, just to make sure that it is going through the right escalation process. But again, transparency is the key in all of this. Show the employee that you're listening to their concern, you're reviewing it, you're hearing it, and you're coming up with a fair outcome at the end. If all internal routes fail, the employee still feels like they've been treated unlawfully, then they obviously do have the option to take this to a tribunal. And this does happen. In terms of employee tribunals for discrimination, there is a 3-month time from the moment that the discrimination happened that they are allowed to bring a claim for. There are some extenuating circumstances that mean it can go beyond that. But I think it's really important for all organisations to remember that may be a possible outcome if the individual is still not happy at the end. And the best advice to give you is to make sure that thorough processes are followed, it is impartial, everything is documented, communication happens throughout the whole process, and where necessary, seek specialist professional advice from either your internal HR team or your outsourced support. We give a lot of support in more pay to discrimination claims or discrimination issues that happen. And they are very tricky and complicated, even for experienced HR professionals, because every single one is different. And it's important to take your time and get it right, whilst also focused on getting the right outcome and not delaying it. But it is always in the back of our minds when we're advising customers that this may go to a tribunal. So what can we do to help you in that situation and put you in the best position to be able to defend that if you've gone through all the right routes? So the last part then, before we move on to questions, is around building a DE&I strategy and how you can put this in place and develop effective initiatives. Now, there are some things that certain companies have to do around discrimination, and as the years go on, this list of things that will need to be done and reported on will grow. But at the moment, gender pay gap reportings are compulsory for larger organisations, those with over 250. And it's something that has to be submitted on a regular basis because it's something that the previous and gaps that still exist even in 2025 and they take the data that is given by the organisations to help put initiatives in place and encourage that gender pay gap to be closed. It is really important for businesses who have to do this to be able to do it with ease and simplicity. And using HR software means that employers can effortlessly monitor the rates of pay, and that having analytics tool that sits over a lot of software. So our payroll software has analytics that sit over the top of this that can allow our customers to produce these reports quite easily. But easy to consume reports allow for effective monitoring of the rates of pay by gender, and HR and senior leaders can keep on track of any areas that they need to address, as well as fulfilling their legal obligations. It allows you to look at where the issues are and make decisions about what you're going to do about it. Monitoring diversity is another important area to think about, and it's about understanding what the makeup of your organisation is by collecting data. This in turn allows you to do things beyond any legal requirements. It allows you to analyse the information, look for disparities, look for where you need to focus your efforts, and you're basing that on actual data, factual data. But then it also allows you to look back and measure the success of any initiatives that you are putting in your diversity strategy. So it's a really important thing to consider. However, you just need to remember that you only want to collect what is necessary, be transparent about what you're collecting, define the purpose, and wherever possible, anonymise the data. It's often looked at that you can ask your employees to fill in a diversity form, and I'll talk about that very shortly with an option that we've got to help people do this. But HR leaders can use the software to help monitor the diversity among the workforce. It just really helps visualise what the makeup of your employees, analyse this by department, by team, looks at pay, bonuses, performance, so much more. And delving into your people data with this real focus helps uncover your learnings and shed light on where there's room for improvement. In HR today, data is so important. When I think back to when I started in HR and there wasn't this kind of data out there, it was sometimes hard to make things tangible and really make the initiatives that you're focused on tangible. But this kind of approach really does. So it's very important to think about how you monitor your diversity within your workplace. And then the last main thing to cover then is when you're thinking about your DE&I strategy is how you document this. And the main steps of documenting your strategy is to make sure that you've analysed data, you identify and outline the areas that you want to address, you identify who the stakeholders are and the support groups that you need in place to do this, and you create an action plan. And having all this documented, regularly reviewed, regularly updated will really keep this at the forefront of your culture. It will change, and the things that you want to focus on will change from year to year. It will change with updates in the law, and we probably can see quite a few updates coming in the law with the new Labour government. It will change with expectations of society, and as younger generations come through who've been brought up in a very different world, their expectations will change. But having this documented strategy that can evolve and is agile will be really key. And the things that you need to consider covering in your D&E strategy is thinking about things like your talent acquisition approach, your training and development opportunities that you've got within the organisation, how you make sure that there's fair and equitable recognition for your employees across the organisation. And then that extends into reward as well, and thinking about pay parity. Once you've done all that, then it is about measuring and monitoring the impact, because it is all great having things written down and trying to implement these initiatives, but then you need to understand, have they worked? What do you need to do differently? What do you need to change going forward? So it's just like with any other HR initiative, tracking its impact is absolutely critical. And the way that you do this is through having regular reviews with the right people involved, whether that's working groups, senior leaders, involving all different parts of the organisations. I've already briefly mentioned surveys, but they can be really powerful in understanding where there are potential issues and what people feel about your DE&I efforts. It can give you some really powerful data. And then always remember what the goal is. What are you actually trying to achieve from this strategy? Again, it's putting action against words, and you should have outlined what the action plan and the goals were in that strategy. But keep that in mind as you are measuring the impacts, and feed back to the organisation. Keep it something that you talk about. You talk about updates, you talk about changes, you talk about things that have worked, things that have happened. Be open and honest with the organisation, and then ask for their feedback. And that's really critical. The last thing to talk about then, before we go on to Q&A, because I am conscious of time, and it is just such a, as I said at the beginning, it's just such a huge topic. I mentioned around equality, diversity and inclusion monitoring. Now, we have a ready-to-use template that can help organisations in terms of monitoring their information with ease. So even if you didn't have it within the software, this is the sort of form that you could use to collect the data and at least give you a start with how your organisation looks and where you might want to focus your efforts. So I think this is something that's really brilliant that we can put out there and help the people who are on this webinar and beyond to start thinking about the makeup of their organisation and where they want to focus their efforts. So I'm going to hand back to Molly now. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I can help with a few questions and answers now. Apologies again for the technical issues that we had at the beginning. Hopefully we have resolved them now, and we got the bulk of this through. I know it is a huge topic. I could have sat here for hours. We've tried to condense it sort of into these 40 minutes. I will hand over to Molly now for the questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really insightful session, as always. If you haven't popped questions in already, if you'd like to ask a question, please just pop it into the question panel, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. I've had quite a few questions coming in about that template, so there is a link to the template within the slides, which we'll be sending out later on, so you can access that and download it for free. Michelle, we've had a question from Danny asking surrounding regular surveys. How often is considered regular?
So in terms of general engagement surveys, originally I think surveys were kind of done once a year. I know that back in the days when we first started doing surveys in the company that I worked for before, it was kind of a once a year activity, and it was a huge manual activity, but that, again, like everything else, has changed and evolved. And I think probably the best place to land at the moment is either quarterly or 6 monthly. I think what you need to think about is that you can do different types of surveys. So if I talk about what we do within our own organisation, we do 2 larger surveys with quite lengthy questions once every 6 months. And then we fit in between those smaller pulse surveys where we ask a shortened version of those questions. So essentially we ask employee engagement surveys, which includes questions about DE&I on a quarterly basis to our organisation. You want to get regular in-time feedback, but you need to balance that without surveying out people. So it is a balancing act. There are many different ways of doing it, but I would suggest sort of a minimum quarterly, but think about how you reduce that. There are some organisations that do surveys every month and just stick to very short, sharp and sweet surveys and just try and get quick pulses of information every month, and that works for some organisations. It's finding the balance, but I really would say minimum quarterly to 6 monthly to have real life data, because if you only do it once a year, you find that by the time you get the information, you review it all, you take and start doing action plans, you're probably a little bit out of date, and it'll be a while before you get some new ones. So it's keeping it regular and as agile as possible. And there are lots of great options out there for software to support.
Brilliant, thanks, Michelle. Another question here from Gabriella. Are grievances hearings normally run by a line manager with the support of an HR team member? And also, they've asked what happens after the grievance meeting, and who conducts this normally if it's an investigation.
Yeah, so when a grievance comes in, you need to make the decision of who is appropriate to hear this. So think about who the grievance is against. So it could be against a line manager, so you wouldn't automatically go to the individual's line manager. You may look for somebody impartial and a line manager in another part of the organisation to hear it, so they can step in. So take account of who the grievance involves, pick a line manager who is appropriate to hear it, and I would always advise having HR support for that line manager, whether that is like one of our more pay customers who has advice and guidance over the phone, or using one of our consultants or your own internal HR team. The grievance meeting is to listen, to understand, to take details of what their concerns are, and to ask open questions to give that investigation manager all the information they need to decide what investigation and who they need to speak to happens next. So once they've had that meeting, they will need to go and do their investigations, come to a conclusion, write an outcome letter, and share that outcome with the individual. And you can share that in person, followed up in writing, or you can just send out the letter, and they will always have the right to appeal after that first stage.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here, just asking if you could please talk a little bit about discrimination by association and what it defines.
So discrimination by association, that is a very good question. It's quite a complex area of law. I assume by that they mean that you are potentially you have an elderly mother who is considered disabled, and you are caring for that mother, and that is impacting your work. I'm going to assume that's what the question means. That is a protected characteristic in terms of that you cannot be discriminated because of your association or your sort of obligations to somebody, if I was taking that disabled example. So if you have a situation where somebody's work is being impacted because of something outside of work in association with someone in a protected characteristic, you really need to seek specific advice on that case. They are quite complex to work through, and there is protection for people in those situations. So my best advice here would be to, whatever that specific incident is or issue is, to seek advice on it, because there are a number of factors to take into account. For using that example, if somebody has an obligation to an elderly parent who is considered disabled and they need to visit them in the morning, and that means they may come into work half an hour later, that could be considered a reasonable adjustment because of their association or their obligation to somebody. So yeah, complicated area, but definitely seek specialist advice.
Thank you. Next question, how do you decide if you're going to take a formal or informal approach when something is initially raised?
A lot of this will be led by the individual. If it's an extremely serious allegation and you read on the face of it that there is a serious allegation of discrimination, I would always advise that you take the formal route to make sure that you have covered every angle. If it's something that you're unsure of, sit down and have an open and honest conversation with that individual and see if it is something that can be resolved informally. Be led by that person. Don't guide them to one way or another. Just give them the option. But do be wary if something comes in that is seemingly very serious, that it is probably best to go down the formal route. A lot of the time with HR, we do say if it can be informal, that's better, because you can usually all kind of move on and agree a lot quicker and faster. But you want to make sure that that isn't a downfall, that you've missed something quite serious. Be led by the individual, and even where you're led by the individual and it has been informally resolved, just make sure that you documented that you had that conversation and it was their request to resolve it informally.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we've just got time for one more question. So what are your thoughts as to a company undertaking health questionnaires prior to commencement of employment and a referral to occupational health, if there are any medical concerns documented?
Yeah, it is still quite common practice for health questionnaires, and it can still be done. I guess you just need to be careful if an employee refuses or does not want to take part in this.
the whole aim of these, and they've been around for a long time now, the pre-employment health questionnaires were to make sure that any major issues were brought up at the beginning and that support could be put in place for that employee and that it was all known and upfront. And I think in most cases, as long as you are very open, honest, and you document and you're transparent about what people in the spirit that it's intended. So I think it's something that can still be done. Just make sure that you're very transparent about it and have a process in place if somebody refuses to take part in it. And again, I know I say this a lot, I probably sound like a broken record on these, but seek advice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for taking the time to answer those questions as well. So before we wrap up, I'd just like to point you all in the direction of our Knowledge Centre. It's really easy to find in the menu of our website, and it's packed with loads of really helpful resources, including upcoming webinars, guides and blogs, and plus everything is free to download. Now, if you'd like to find out a bit more about our software and services, there'll be a pop-up form once we close the webinar where you can register your interest, and one of my colleagues will be in touch with you. Something that may be of interest is our HR and employment law services. So our HR advice line runs 24/7, 365 days a year. So no matter when an HR issue crops up, best practice employment law advice is always available over the phone, anytime, delivered by our highly experienced team of qualified experts. So that's everything from us today. Apologies again about the few technical issues that we had. And thank you so much, Michelle, for delivering a wonderful webinar, really insightful as always. Thank you to everyone who joined, and I hope you found today's session useful. As I said at the beginning, we'll be sending out a recording of this morning and a copy of the slides later today, so keep an eye on your inbox. Thank you so much for joining. I'm now going to close the webinar.